Welcome, everybody. Today is another Tuesday after Labor Day holiday. So we're still getting up and ready with the week. I personally am somewhat, I would say, jet lagged or tired over the weekend. And I'm sure some of you, and Ted included, are suffering from the weekend sort of tiredness. But nonetheless, hi everybody. This is a weekly Tuesday show where Ted and I get to talk about some of the things that we like, anything involving around AEC, tech, life, or whatever things that we feel like talking about. So either you're watching it live or on recording, welcome. And if you are happen to be joining us during the stream, then we would be happy to chat with you. Just leave comments or chat on the stream. Then we'll be happy to discuss whether it be question or some of the comments that you want to make. We'll welcome those. So today I kind of titled it as History of V-Ray, the past of the industry leading renderer. And I think it's sort of the loaded sentence right there. And
Yeah.
I'm going to try and leverage Ted's expertise and his experience in explaining that title. I just titled it myself. So I don't know how much of what Ted is about to tell you guys holds to what I have said on the title. But why don't you just kind of take it away? I'll let you lead on this one.
All right. All right. So let me start with a little bit of background history on me, how I got into this, and how I ended up as product manager for Vray for Sketchup 3.0. So my career started as an architect, well, as an architect to be with a firm out of Dallas called GFF, Good Fulton and Farrell Architects, and in that role, I was tasked with another artist, a good friend of mine, Andrew, to test out some software. At the time, we were doing a lot of testing with V-Ray 2, 1.6, I think it was, or 1.49, and then 1.6. Some pretty early versions of the plugin. This is going back 2011, 2012, I guess. Um, and shortly after we were doing the testing, V-Ray 2.0 launched. And 2.0 was a big jump in what kind of capabilities you could have inside of SketchUp. And I'm talking about V-Ray for SketchUp specifically in this little chat. We realized early on that being able to use proxies inside of SketchUp versus going and bringing our models from SketchUp to Max and using proxies in Max was way easier because then design changes could happen and we weren't constantly updating the Max file and jumping back and forth. Because at that point in time, we were doing 3ds Max and Mental Ray, which is a long, arduous process. Anyways, we're testing these products and just as we're testing these products, I'm in the forums a lot. And I'm talking to a number of other users, and I keep breaking the software beyond what the developers expected to break because I was pushing it. A lot of those like failures to render usually ended up being SketchUp's fault because SketchUp at the time was still 32-bit, and 32-bit, if you don't know, can only access 4 gigs of RAM total. 64-bit processing allows you to access the full amount of RAM on the system.
Is that
So
the only limitation, though?
I'm sure there are others, but that was the big limitation for SketchUp being 32-bit instead of 64-bit. And SketchUp hadn't upgraded to 64-bit until 2013 or 2014, I
It was
think.
quite late, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that was the big jump in ability to use the software. So as I'm being a royal pain in the developers' collective butts on the forums, I noticed coincidentally on LinkedIn there was an ad for an artist at Chaos Group, and I was like, I'm just gonna apply. This looks like I'm never gonna get this, but I'm gonna apply. And sure enough, one thing led to another, and I got a call from the acting. I believe his title was
Director?
vice president or director of product, or maybe it was director of AEC products. But it was a VP of AEC is generally what it came down to. Corey Rubidoux, and he was great. He brought me out, sat me down, had a good conversation with him, with the rest of the team. One thing led to another, and I was moving to Maryland to the team here in Chaos Group Baltimore, who started off as ASG Viz.
Mhm.
They were a part of a company called Air St. Gross here in Baltimore. They did architectural visualization, but while they were doing ArcViz, they kind of branched into developing some software, which was Vray for Sketchup. They licensed the Vray core app and created their own plugin around that. Now, what people don't really know is V-Ray 2.0, the reason it looks so
Old.
janky, even at the time, wasn't because the developers on staff at ASG Viz were not good developers. It was because there was no roadmap on how V-Ray worked. And essentially what V-Ray 2.0 did was take all of those buttons and resources and dump them into a Python-based container that we or they at the time had to organize in a cohesive sort of way. So there was no, and for those of you who don't know anything about software development, usually if you're plugging a software into another piece of software, there is an app SDK. And that's kind of, like I said, the roadmap to what plugins go to where. We didn't have that. There was no app SDK. It was just V-Ray core, the back end, and what we punched out in the front end. And by we, it was ASG Viz. Now, Chaos Group, they kind of realized that they had a cool thing going. They pulled everybody in under one umbrella. I think they bought ASG Viz back in 2012, 2011, 2012. And then I came on in 2013 as one of their first hires or early hires as an artist. At which point I sat next to Joe, who was the lead developer at the time, and periodically broke his software over and over and over again, and made his life a nightmare because 2.0 was so buggy. And
Did
really,
he ever get very frustrated?
no, he would laugh about it.
Oh, really?
He thought it was hilarious, mostly because um, he was like, I genuinely don't know how you did this. How did you break this so aggressively? So I think he really enjoyed it. And just to remind everybody how janky that user interface was, like this was it. And not to say that this wasn't pretty well developed. It was what could be created with the time, experience, and team that was available to create this. And it was a great piece of software. It was lighter than anything else. It was faster than anything else, and it offered more control than anything else at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But man, this is a pretty low res. I don't have a lot of my V-Ray 2 content. It's all been lost on a hard drive somewhere. So yeah, but it was not easy to use, but it was the best thing that we had at the time for SketchUp. I think it was this. Twilight Render was popular.
Kirky
Thea
Thea?
was.
Yeah.
This is a little after Kirky Thea,
Mm-hmm.
because Kirky Thea was that was back when I
1.6
was in
days.
college.
Yeah.
Oof. And then Thea, and there was another one that I'm blanking on right now. So there were a few products out
Podium?
here, but Podium, that was the one I was trying to think of. Yeah, but V-Ray was kind of the one that had all the things. It had lights, it had proxies, it had control over environments, it had HDRI lighting, it had a lot of stuff. So anyways, yeah, so when I came on at 2.0 and broke everything. And, Joe and I fixed bug after bug after bug as I came across them. I documented and provided him feedback and said, this is how you break it. This is what I did. Some of it he says, oh, that's user error, and explained to me how to do it better, which I would take notes on as, okay, this is UI stuff, and we need to think about how this user interface works a little bit better. And then, I'd go back to breaking it. And yeah, it went back and forth like that for a couple of years. No, about a year before um, we were like, okay, we're on V-Ray 2.6 now. We need to start looking forward to V-Ray 3. And that's when we really started to look at how to generate a piece of software that is really more intuitive user interface. I think at the time we had some really cool ideas. But again, it came back to what we had for budget, the time available, and the team available. So we ended up getting a couple of really good app developers alongside the Bulgarian team in our office here in Baltimore. And before we even got into developing, we needed to start building a framework. And that was kind of the big jump into kind of what you start to see today. So this is one of our earliest sketchboard experiences, and you'll recognize some of this. So I think you at this point can tell what that is. But we came up with this flyout
UI,
panel
yeah.
system, simplified in the center, content on the left, advanced on the right. That way, if you knew what you were looking at and you wanted more, you could jump into the advanced stuff. If you didn't know a lot and you just needed to get your feet wet, that was in the middle. And then everybody wanted to use the content library. And we had some pretty big ideas for content library stuff. And I'll get into some of that here too. But the big thing with this is we had to, once we had a framework that we all agreed upon, because at this point we had an artist for SketchUp, an artist for Revit, an artist for Rhino, all as separate product managers. And we were all talking about what could and couldn't work. At that point, we didn't know Revit would be as big a bear as it is to develop inside of. We ended up getting there, but man, it was brutal. But we also had this really cool concept of a palette. So we
Oh,
saw this
dial.
in Blender, and Modo and a few others, and we were like, well, why can't we have that in SketchUp? Why can't we have that in Rhino? And we started talking about what the technology would be to do that. How do we make that thing work? So in one of our early tests, I think Noel and Pole created some early palettes. So this is actually, let me share my other screen here. So we started down this path, and this was exciting at the time and something we were really interested in pursuing. Because, we were thinking, well, how do we make it less intrusive? So we were like, well, what if it's just a radial dial that only activates when we hover over it? We stick it in a corner until we need something. I'm doing this thing over here, I bring it over, and I need cameras, or I need geometry, materials, lights. So we made this as kind of a test, and we liked this idea, and then we were also testing what kind of tech uh, would uh, would be required to kind of build this palette, this window. Um, Obviously, this is also sort of janky. Oh, here we go. Um, but it was the start. These are really, really early builds. And then the same thing we were looking at, well, what if we do something like this? Maybe it's horizontal. And we tested this out, and we kind of played with it, and we put it in front of some artists, and some people liked it, some people thought it was terrible.
Hmm.
We could load things in. But it was one of those things where we were starting to test out what was possible. Now, what we found as we got down into this rabbit hole is this thing, while it's a great idea, it just wasn't feasible. It would have taken too much development time. It was a little too heavy on the front end. The HTML, I think this was before Electron. I don't know what we were using, and I'm getting a little technical here. But this was HTML web script stuff that we did just to see if it would work and look interesting. And we were happy with it for the most part, but it was one of those things where, yeah, we realized really quickly it just wasn't going to happen. So we sort of nixed that concept and started down sort of the more traditional route of click the button, open a window, work that way. But now what we needed to do was build that framework out in Vray and understand where everything went. So you remember how I was saying before about Vray 2 and Vray 1 not having a roadmap? By Vray 3, we didn't necessarily have a roadmap per se, but we had a closer tie with the home office in Bulgaria, who had a better understanding of what plugin did what and how it was meant to be used. Because in a lot of the 2.0 stuff, we were using it wrong. We had things coded backwards because we didn't know. There were words that were spelled wrong because they were spelling English words as a non-native English speaker. So, certain words weren't spelled correctly, so the developers were having a real time trying to link things correctly, and it would break a lot. So now we've got a really good connection with them. We're evolving kind of that conversation back and forth, trying to really explore what went where. And we're starting to wireframe things out in a more direct sense. So let me see here. Let's see. So now we're getting into kind of the development side of things. And if you want to see what it takes to develop software, or UI, I should say.
I remember. Okay, so I did this when I was just not even a developer, just
Hmm.
as a user because the settings were so tricky and I had to just get it right every time. So I had to open up every single flyout and then make sure all of my values are correct throughout
Right.
different machines and all. So I did this too.
Yes. So essentially do that, but on an extra set of levels where not only do you have to figure out what everything does, you have to figure out whether it stays or goes. So because what we were trying to do, we were trying to add in things that no one had control over, like um, blend angles and figuring out how we can do um, you know, uh, uh, you know, uh, Bezier curves to control fall off and things like that. We didn't know what we couldn't do, but we were trying to figure it out. And then on top of that, we were trying to make this simple for users. So what can we control on the back end that users don't need? What can we just have automated? And what do we actually have to have exposed? So we went through
Like a
3ds
slide
Max.
bar instead
Hmm.
of arbitrary numbers.
Yeah, so instead of like for marble, instead of vein color, filter color parameters, have those boiled down into I want a dark marble with veining, I want a Calcutta gold, something like that. That's what we were aiming for with those parametric materials. Um, whether we got there is a different story, but we had to go through every single one of these, and I made every single one of these in a program called Balsamic, and it it took me, I want to say, 3 weeks to get through every single one of these things, and then we had to wireframe it out so that these noise textures need to pull from all the noise palettes, da 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 da, noise max, noise maya, da 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 da. So there was a lot of this research that we had to do, and develop, and it just went forever, it felt like. So once we had those, we went back to our whiteboard, and this is what we refer to as our whiteboard. We had a digital whiteboard that we worked from, and this kind of comes back to, what we were originally working on. Woo! Sorry.
This is a team of how
Um,
many people, by the way?
this is a team of, I'd say, 3 core developers, maybe 4, and maybe 3 or 4 artists, so 5 or 6 people total, and then
Just
managers
on
and everybody
SketchUp.
else. But SketchUp, Rhino, and then Revit later on. So this was all under the AEC umbrella.
Okay.
So it was me, Fernando Rentas as the product lead for Rhino, who is a master of Rhino,
Mm-hmm.
Ben Hurlbutt, who is Revit guru. He was great. And he was the product manager for that stack. And all 3 of us together, we went through this stuff. Ben, I hesitate to guess he's still got it somewhere. But he put together one of the most ridiculously meticulous spreadsheets I've ever seen. Pretty much programming Vray for anything, for custom settings and stuff. So anyways, before we went down the palette, we did this mock-up and we talked about, what could we do? How does this translate? And then we quickly realized, okay, it doesn't work. The palette's not working. Let's move on. So let's start doing, this guy. And then what does that start to look like? Well, we started pulling from everything that we could, that we wanted, because we had this coup de grace in our head. What do we want V-Ray for SketchUp to be? Well, we want it to be the most powerful, but the most effective. So we were talking about, how do we get a node graph editor? And we actually had this working. We actually had a
Really?
node graph editor working in a build. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional, and it got scrapped. And I still to this day wish it hadn't gotten scrapped, because it was a beautiful thing that Noel programmed. He was the lead SketchUp programmer. He was in Barcelona, Spain, with another developer named Paul Martin. And Noel and Paul did such an amazing job developing the user interface and some of the back end tools. And I still can't believe Noel got this working, but it didn't work well enough that we wanted to keep it in the product. So it ended up getting scrapped.
Hmm.
We experimented with it. We talked about, how do we bring it all together? This is what we wanted. And then we got to actual programming, and this is what we kind of could do. So there's a lot of, what do we want? This. What can we do? That. So, time, budget, resources. So what we ended up with was this early first iteration of a look and style. Once we figured out what we could do, we started getting into this. And this is like the V-Ray 0.01 3.0 version, and we're still tinkering with the node graph editor in here. And we wanted to do all kinds of stuff, like we've got an asset, what is the asset attached to? And node graphs for everything on the back end, a light and a dark UI. So we started getting into some of that, and that's where this early mock-up kind of came from. Talking about the online material browser, this is really early on. We had the standard material browser and the online material browser, and this is in 2014, I think. We were talking about this. It's now 2021, and Chaos Group only just released the online cloud library and the what's it called now? The
V-Ray
Cosmos.
Next and Cosmos. Okay.
Cosmos, yeah. That's their online content browser. We were working on something like this, but we just didn't have the infrastructure to do it. And I'm so glad to see that they've kind of brought that out. So yeah, we were exploring looks for this. We wanted it to feel a little bit more like Max, but not too far into Max. What are the cameras, the materials, the lights? We wanted to set up a full scene browser so that you could have preview scenes, um, camera properties, everything opened. Let's see. Um, yeah, so this is our Cosmos um, whenever this was. This is what we really wanted to build. Um, the light library, domes, and just
I till this day though, like I have to criticize this. I don't understand the bi folding or bi flap on the UI. It's very confusing, I must say.
yeah, and I think this was a route that we went down that we couldn't go back from once we were there.
Right. I
Um,
understand that, but just
I
to
still,
flat out criticize is that
ouch.
I don't see any other application that has this sort of bi flat UI. It's
We
always
were
on
ahead of
one
the time.
side. Oh,
We were ahead of time.
it's still
Um,
ahead.
we're still ahead of our time. So what we were looking at the time was how do we make a condensed versus an expanded version without doing rollouts, because there was a big push because 2.0 and 1.0 had such terrible user
Roll.
interface with the
Yeah.
rollouts forever. We were trying to circumvent that sort of work, and we were like, well, what if it's sort of like a book and you open the pages, you know how do we make it simplified so that it's 3 bricks, 3 boxes here, and that's it. Because what we also didn't want to have is a dozen different windows. Our original goal for this was also, and I don't think it's here, it might be here. Our original goal for this was to have, like, let's see here, everything all in this right up into the frame buffer. Um, yeah, let's see. Yeah, we wanted to include the frame buffer in the window too. And this is Noel's funny little thing about overlays.
Overlay.
Um,
You get overlay.
yeah, yeah. So we wanted to give the option of overlays because that's something that is new and hasn't been done before. But also, if you were a traditionalist, you get your render scene view. But the goal was, I mean, we even had things like, how do we think about Vray on a phone? Some early crazy stuff. But we were trying to combine the frame buffer in this UI as well. That way you weren't always constantly jumping around. And the other side of this was those flyouts. When we designed this initially, the goal was to be able to break them apart and put them back together based on what you needed. But limitations, time, and technical constraints kept us from doing that. Because that was, yes, the flyouts were the thing, but imagine if those flyouts could come apart and be rearranged so that the UI could move to wherever you want it.
Mm-hmm.
That was our other eventual goal, but it didn't end up happening that way. So there were caveats to just about everything, including we explored, working with Sketchup on a V-Ray warehouse that would have libraries of materials because we didn't have the infrastructure to build out a full Cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
But this never really materialized, mostly because we also didn't have enough artists, and the 3D warehouse didn't support
Like a
content
material.
inside of SketchUp that had linked content to it. You couldn't resource collect inside of SketchUp's 3D warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, lots of caveats, lots of weird things that we explored but maybe didn't end up using. And then it was just pretty much from there, how do we get this thing out the door? All right, I just need to get the wireframes done. Uh, and yeah, this is what we kind of ended up with as far as a final um, mock-up for the developers to build from. So
Interesting.
yeah, yeah. So that's kind of the history of how this whole thing um, went from, this really light palette, sort of like an artist's palette is what we were approaching it as, to just, more traditionalist. Because there's also a lot of pushback in the forums about changing anything in 2.0, like a lot of pushback.
Mm-hmm.
They
I'm
didn't want
sure.
simpler. They wanted more things. They wanted more assets. And you can see this as a perfect example if you look at an old version of Enscape, which was really light and easy and kind of simple to use, versus the newest version of Enscape. Anybody jumping into Enscape for the first time can get a little overwhelmed because there's a lot of new buttons. The old Enscape, it was just like click and go, and that
Yep.
was it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Enscape now has lots more functionality. They've got their assets library, so there's a lot more to get lost in. Now, I'm not comparing it to V-Ray in any way, shape, or form because it is so much more streamlined. But I think we were trying to do it, and then Enscape did it really well. So, but yeah, oh god, there were so many.
Well, I must excuse V-Ray though, because at this change, at the point of this change, or there's pushbacks and all, but when these decisions are being made and being thought of, V-Ray itself had a lot more functionality. It had a lot more
Mhm.
values and things to consider for than the other renders that are much simpler. So
Yeah,
you know it's you need to change in a way that it is laid out and somewhat organized in more user-friendly interface way, but not necessarily disabling any of the figures and numbers and the values
yeah,
that you can
yep,
currently tweak with. It may become a little bit more cumbersome or a bit easier from what you were doing, but you can't simply take out a certain type of functionality, and that's your huge limit in terms of being able to clean
yeah,
up the
yeah.
organization.
And that was the other side of this is users were pushing back on us, and the home office was pushing back on us because they didn't want us to take anything out. We were gonna gut V-Ray and make it the simple, like lightweight render that it used to be. And there was some talk about how do we make this an artist tool versus or a designer's tool versus a Viz artist tool. And home office was like, no, we're not doing that. You can't do that. That's off the table. So we ended up, these are some early mock-ups to um, um,
The
early
UI.
mock-ups to UI tests. So this was done by a developer named Mike Taylor here in Baltimore, and this was like some really, really early stuff, converting our wireframes into something. So, but yeah, like Tony's saying, you definitely have more creative freedom with V-Ray, but also if you've got a deadline and you don't know how to do something in V-Ray, you can get real stuck real fast.
And not all creatives have freedom.
Yes.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Not all, like I didn't have. Basically knew about 10 different values that does things that I want it to be, and I just stuck with it. I didn't bother any of other buttons that are or numbers
Mm-hmm.
that are present to me because I have no idea what this thing does, and I'm not gonna spend next hour or so figuring out what it may or may not do to my scene. So
Yeah.
that's why I had to understand some of things in the interface and understand what it does and how it impacts my view or scene. And that was pretty much it. And as long as I can get what I want, then I'm okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, um, it's and it's also kind of a fine line between get what you want and um, knowing how to get what you want. I'm kind of talking in circles. There, I found after a certain point having such a intimate knowledge of V-Ray, I wouldn't use the actual render. I could set everything up without looking at a single render and kind of know roughly what it would look like. Set my ISO or my camera, set my exposure, put in my lights, set their lumen value to something that worked, that I knew worked in the past. It's one of those things where if you do it enough, it becomes second nature. And I wouldn't actually click render until I was done with the scene. And then when I was done with the scene, I'd hit render. It'd come out close to what I thought, and I'd have to tweak some settings. But when you have that level of knowledge, it becomes difficult to talk to somebody who doesn't have that level of knowledge,
Right. It's like
because then.
because you end up always putting the same amount of reflection value, same amount of
Mhm.
artificial light intensity. The setups become exactly the same. It just becomes how many you put down or
Exactly.
how many materials that you
And
tweak.
that was the big thing when we were doing this early on. We were taking that knowledge base of my knowledge, Fernando, Ben, and the other artists, and saying, okay, how do we boil that down into just like click, 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 and you've got a scene set up? Let's set these lights to a sensible value. Let's set all the materials ready to go out of the box. We actually even tinkered around with an early version of what Enscape was doing, where if your material had a certain keyword in it, it would recognize that keyword and set up a material for you. But the problem was we would end up getting pushback from like other artists because there wasn't enough of a difference between the SketchUp
Light.
UI and the Rhino UI. So because SketchUp and Rhino shared interfaces, um, and shared a lot of the back end program. If we would do something in SketchUp, sometimes that would break a workflow in Rhino,
Right. Oh, I
because they
see. I
weren't
see.
completely broken from each other. You had V-Ray Core, you had V-Ray 3.0 UI, and then that plugged into Revit or Rhino and SketchUp.
I
So a lot
wonder
of the back
if
end stuff.
other software like such as, you keep mentioning Enscape because we understand
Well, it's
Enscape
the
quite
only
well.
other one who really does it, where they
So
plug into everything.
right, right. So I wonder if they do exactly the same thing because, they are not only Revit, SketchUp, Rhino, but ArchiCAD and Vectorworks. So, they need to worry about a whole lot more, and whatever
Oh
change
yeah,
that you make, it needs to apply. Although there are some uniqueness to each render, in each 3D applications, such as like a
correct.
SketchUp, it has proxy, whereas there's nothing in Revit. But
Yeah.
that's something that I guess, as a developer, something to be mindful of and think about.
Yeah, and it was a big problem. I mean, going to Revit was probably the biggest hurdle because Revit is such a different beast, and Revit has like very limiting API. So with Revit, you can only plug into to it in their 3D section. Like you can only use the plugin in their 3D section. That's a limitation of their Revit API. We had to do a ton of reverse engineering to get even early versions of V-Ray for Revit to work remotely functional. Um, and that thing is a bear to develop for. I am so glad I wasn't on the Revit team. But I think V-Ray for Revit did a pretty good job of generating a nice plugin that was usable. I think Revit's problem is Revit. ArcViz and Revit is just not a thing you want to do. You can get some general illustrations out of Revit, but it doesn't it sort of limits your ability to model one-off instances of things and model in a more convenient way. So like, let's say I've got one scene that I want to make look really, really good. If I fillet the edge on a countertop, that fillets every edge on every countertop in that family. So I have to make a custom family, and I may not be exactly correctly communicating this because I'm not an avid Revit user, but I know enough that yeah, Revit is a bear to model inside of. So it was also a bear to develop inside of,
Because
which was
well,
frustrating.
the core functionality is the way I kind of describe is this. So in SketchUp, if you want, like let's say you've got an architecture overall, furniture at the least, it's very common that even in Revit, like you don't even have furniture. All you got is floor, walls, and ceilings and roof. That's
Hmm.
usually the typical thing, and you have to find that specific furniture that you need, and which is a task on its own, and be able to parametrically kind of assigns values to the families, and developing
Hmm.
families inside of Revit is a problem on its own. But then when it comes to actual a bit more decoration, let's say furniture, and now you've got to have plates and knives and forks and napkins on top of a
What
dinner
family does that
table.
live in?
So where do you find those things, and where can you find ones that look okay and doesn't become huge? Because you can have a plate that is essentially heavier than your entire architectural project, because how much of a complexity in terms of texture and
Hmm.
geometry and the triangulation, and you've got beautifully laid out 2D drawing, and now your plate or whatever that you put on top of the table is all triangulated and not looking
Yeah.
great, then now you got to spend time making that model, assigning correct materiality, and it's just a pain to do a model, because like in order to get a meaningful render or a good looking render, putting down enough of detail, materiality, and just putting a bit of decor inside of your scene is critical, and you can't do
Yeah.
that in Revit, and that becomes a huge limitation. And in SketchUp, it's simple. You just draw a
Build
circle
the thing.
and
Yeah.
then and then just extrude or
Because it's
push
a
pull a little
dumb
bit.
mesh modeler. Yeah.
Yeah, but Revit you can too, but it takes a bit more steps to do that. In
Yeah.
SketchUp maybe 4 or 5 clicks you can do that, but in Revit it becomes 10. You can do it. It's just 10, 20, and it just really adds.
Yeah. Exponentially more difficult.
Hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why like a lot of firms are like, well, why don't my renderings look so good inside of Revit? And it's because they're rendering inside of Revit. And it's very difficult to get a good rendering inside of Revit. And it's not their fault. It's not Revit's fault. Revit was never designed as a pretty picture program. It was designed as a production tool and essentially a glorified spreadsheet.
Documentation. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
more of a documentation
The
tool.
the best description of Revit I've ever heard is from a professor of mine, Professor Dietz, who was teaching us. He's like, don't think of Revit as a 3D modeler. Think of it as a spreadsheet with 3D models inside of it. And essentially, that's kind of what it comes down to. Is it's a ledger of parts and pieces that you then put together in 3D space.
And
Um,
even for Enscape, what I kind of feel like, or I think because the API inside of or SDK API SDK becomes so convoluted and difficult to develop with in Revit, what I feel like, because this is my observing only because I don't actually know the back end development inside of Enscape and Revit and all of that, because I'm not remotely programmable or programming savvy. But what I see is that Revit basically spits out this, or you export Revit 3D model, and then basically render in Inkscape. And that's what I feel like all other renderers for Revit does. So basically, instead of rendering what's inside of Revit, it exports it briefly and then render outside of Revit is what I feel like, because it is instantaneous, and any changes that you make will apply to Revit, or sorry, on Enscape, or any other renderer,
Hmm.
but it takes a few moments longer as it progresses further from Revit to the render. Whereas it's not the same in something like SketchUp, where things change and the change is immediate. You don't have to export the entire thing, but in Revit, you always have to go through the entire change. Even if you just change one little thing, it has to spit out the whole thing again.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that was how that worked in Revit. I know I working in really large scenes inside of SketchUp, sometimes I get some problems with automatic updates and um,
But you don't see
it,
a progress bar.
sometimes I have to. So
It's
I
like you
have
have
gotten
to
in
refresh
situations,
it,
it's
right?
rare.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
With larger models, it causes more problems, especially with like certain plugins. Like Round Corner causes problems all the
Yeah,
time,
you
and you
don't
get
you
leftover
make it and
geometry.
nothing shows up, or like
Yeah,
geometry
yeah,
flies over, so you need to reset it. You need to hard
yeah.
reset it. But what I mean
Which is a
is,
problem in really big scenes. But in
well,
Revit, it seems like it does that anytime any change happens.
yeah, so
Ugh.
like if you have a simple model and then you just moved over like a one furniture, and a progress bar will appear and it has to spit out the entire thing once more.
So big models, it gets exponentially more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
That's frustrating. I have a feeling that's probably a Revit API issue, not an Enscape
Yeah,
issue.
so what it
Obviously.
feels like to me is the fact that, yeah, it is somewhat working inside or in conjunction with Revit
Mhm,
API, but essentially what it is doing is it is exporting the 3D model off of it and offloading onto the
mhm.
separate development that Enscape has, instead of working inside of the Revit.
Yeah, because Revit doesn't allow you to work inside it, period. Like there's
Exactly.
no point in time where you can work inside of that program. So, as a developer, I mean. But yeah, it's definitely a hard program to manage. I know I've heard good things about Vectorworks, and I've heard some good things about um, Enscape for ArchiCAD as well. So I've seen some really cool stuff come out of
I
those.
know very little about Rhino, so I can't really speak for it either.
Rhino's a great program.
It
I wish
is.
I knew. I wish I knew enough to be dangerous inside of Rhino, because there's a lot of tools and functionality that you know. It's it it's more of a product design tool than an architecture tool, but there's so much opportunity to do cool architecture in it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I
I know a lot of
especially like
architecture firms are moving to it again.
parametric type of modeling. So I
Yeah.
feel like if you touch all three, meaning Revit, SketchUp, and Rhino, then you can pretty much cover all the areas in terms of like 3D modeling. I only cover Revit and SketchUp, where Revit is
You forgot
very
Blender.
well, Blender doesn't have landscape render, so what I mean is, with Revit, you can do a lot of documentation and architecture only, like building design only. With SketchUp, you can cover a lot of bases, but much simpler format. And then with Rhino, I feel like I can get really, really organic, and in a way that I can't really imagine doing inside of Revit or SketchUp alone,
Yeah, yeah. If
or
you can
Blender. I
master
guess
those three
you can do
products,
that.
if you can master those three products, you're a force to contend with. That's for sure.
Yep,
Um,
the triad.
let's see what's Tony saying. I have to ask what you think of V-Ray Vision. What do you think of it? Do you see it matching Enscape and Lumion?
Is it called
So
Vision? I thought it was called something else.
I thought it was no, I think it's Vision.
Okay, I'm lost
I don't
with
know.
some of the
You know what
terminology.
it is though, right? The real-time
Yeah,
V-Ray.
yeah, yeah.
Essentially, it's just a borked version of V-Ray. It just doesn't calculate. It calculates less bounces. It calculates less. Uh, you know, uh, eh, it essentially takes V-Ray and dumbs it down really, really low quality. I don't know what to think of it, honestly. I think it's a good previs tool. I think it's reactionary. I'm not sure the function of it. I think they're like, oh, we have to do real time, so let's do this. And I think it could be a lot better. Um,
I didn't say that. Ted did.
but it's the truth. It's a tool and you can use it. Will I use it? Will I show a client anything from it? No.
Well, what it
But
feels
as a,
like though, however, is when 3.0 came out, and I think it was like 3.1 or a later revision, where the graphic card render was introduced, and the
yeah,
and bigger problem or biggest problem that I had, like I was excited with all of these technology or the sort of newer feature that or hybrid render for that matter, and when it came out, I was all excited for it, but
then you
essentially
used it and you're like, eh.
when I tried it, essentially it was different from CPU render. So that was the biggest problem. Like when I know there's a huge ground up programming that needs to go in order to get both of them working in the same way, and everyone had explained that to me, but I understand that. But the problem is we are experienced as a V-Ray user, and
Hmm.
we are expecting because we know we can, as you said, we imagine things as we model, and we are already seeing it. And then the moment that you hit the render with a graphics card render, it looked different, and I was like, "What is happening?" And either it's because of just a pure bug, or because some of the functions behave differently inside of
I can tell you.
graphics card. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so V-Ray on a graphics card is inherently different from V-Ray on a CPU. That's just, and you know this, traditionally because of the architecture of the two um, tools. When they released V-Ray GPU, even in Max, it didn't look one to one. You had to set scenes up differently for
Mm-hmm.
V-Ray
Mm-hmm.
GPU versus V-Ray, CPU. And there was a developer, Blago Test. I can't pronounce his last name. I can Testivov. Anyways, he was kind of like the GPU god. He knew everything there was about GPU stuff, and we were running into this issue right off the bat. And I was like, "Hey, Blago, what's going on with this?" He's like, "Oh, we just don't support that yet. I haven't written the code, and I haven't been able to fix the code so that it'll work with it. So it just doesn't work yet." And there was a lot of that early on. There's a lot less of it now, but even with like in Max, certain particle simulations don't work on GPU the same as they work on CPU or vice versa. Um, yeah, there's a lot of limitations, and like anything, there's pros and cons to your hardware. Just like you can't use certain GPU-based renders with AMD cards that you can use with
CUDA
NVIDIA
cord. Yeah,
cards.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's just the architectures are all different, so you have to know your tools so you can get the right, you know, you can't hammer a screw, so don't try.
Yeah.
If you're gonna use a screw, get a screwdriver. If you're gonna use a nail, get a hammer.
Hey,
Don't
he's
try and
stealing
hammer
my
the screw.
metaphor. He's stealing my metaphor right there.
Is that
That,
your metaphor? I
that
didn't know that.
no, I use that metaphor for Revit and SketchUp, but
Maybe that's where I heard it subconsciously. It's just back
yeah,
there
now you're
rattling
using it
around.
for something else. But anyways, the reason
I
why I
will
had
remember
brought
to
that.
attribute that to you in the future. I'm sorry.
Sure, sure. The reason why I had brought up the CPU versus GPU render is whenever I tried the Vision for the first time, it felt very same way. It felt like, okay, now it's behaving just enough differently where it's just gonna throw me off completely. Because the thing is, if the CPU render and the GPU render of V-Ray was a different thing, like the UI is different thing or called different thing. If it was V-Ray, traditional V-Ray, and then V-Ray Vision, then it would have made a bit more sense. Like either you develop the model for just regular V-Ray, versus now you're gonna do things
Hmm.
differently because it programmatically it's just different on Vision, so you're gonna make it for Vision. Then it's a two different thing. But the CPU, graphic card, and also hybrid render was all in the same UI, and that was the biggest problem because as a user, you expect as you flick the switch from CPU to GPU, it just flips and then it spits out the same exact render, but it doesn't. And that was a problem. Now, from the GPU render, now going to Vision, it now
Yeah, it
looked
was poor
different too.
communication. It was poor communication, and that's the thing. V-Ray is inherently good at confusing their customers. Um,
That's why you were
or
so good
Chaos
at
Group is,
breaking their thing too.
huh? Yeah, that's probably why.
User error,
Um,
right?
yeah, user error. But that was what we were trying to fix. But it's one of those things where there are certain requirements from those people who are higher up that say your product will have this, this, and this as a requirement, and you get it in there as best you can. Um, you know, it probably didn't function the way it was meant to function because it was shoehorned in. After V-Ray 3.0 launched, I was no longer on the team. I left Chaos Group after that. I made sure my product went out. I made sure the product launched. I stayed for, I believe, 2 weeks after the product launched to hand off to the next team member. And then I was no longer on the project. I left to do my own thing. Whatever they did after that point, whatever they added after that point, typically, that it comes down from the top. So when they say add this in, you add it in. So sometimes whether it works or not, you're like, well, you told me to. So,
Well,
um, but yeah,
to just kind of answer back of Tony's question, I don't see Vision kind of matching Enscape or Lumion just because Enscape and Lumion is developed from and for GPU renders and real time renders, whereas Vision is, as you said, sort of like a catch up kind of thing.
hmm,
So I don't think it is going to be able to, but with huge background in the industry leading renderer, as
yep.
V-Ray is, I think you still have a lot of user base for traditional type of
Well,
V-Ray.
here's my take on that. I don't think it will ever be Enscape or Lumion, not because it can't. I
Right.
absolutely think that Chaos Group has the team, the technology, and the know-how to make that thing a proper real-time render that destroys any other product out there in speed and functionality. The big question is, will they want to do that?
Will the
And
users want to do that?
no, will Chaos Group want to do that? Will they want to commit that level of resources to one product? Because don't forget, Chaos Group is no small company. They've got 300-400 guys working for them, guys and girls that are just cranking on stuff. Their industry is VFX, architecture, product design, motion graphics. It is a big moving train, and it doesn't stop for things. If it doesn't take off, why bother wasting more resources on it to make it great? It could potentially be good, but if they put it out there and people aren't really immediately enamored by it, they may just move on to the next thing. Or they could throw more resources at it to make it better. I just don't really see them doing that. Um, I have a feeling their real time is going to expand over time. I don't think it's going to be in Vision. I think it's going to be a more global approach to real time. and I'm just speculating. I don't know. I don't have any contacts over there who are feeding me good information or anything like that. I'm just guessing. But the reality of it is, Chaos Group, they are smart. They see the future. They see what is coming, and real time is just so much faster. It's but it didn't use it used to be like that in the past. Um, you used to have to cheat with the traditional, CPU based rendering tools. You had to place plane lights at the windows to get, exterior light in. You had to do a lot of these kind of janky things to make it work. And it's like that with anything. So,
Do you think I'm trying to think of like a close representative of what sort of the train of V-Ray is. And if you think of Photoshop, like it's been the industry leader for very, very long time. You just keep on
hmm
adding more and more functionality because of either user or top down. However, the way they implement new functions and has it like it's gone a very, very far away for very, very long time with a very, very large user base, and still arguably is the industry leader in
hmm
how they played this game. When I don't know, I can't think of like a new sort
I
of
mean,
new boy on the street who's disruptive to
um,
Photoshop.
the closest thing would probably be the oh, what is it? I
There are
used
few
the other
there
day.
are very few ones that are like AI based and tools out there. But just because it is from Adobe, it's just so hard
Affinity.
to
There we go.
affinity.
Affinity Photo, Affinity Illustrator, I think it's called. Um, that is a great alternative to Photoshop. I've used it. It works really well. It's got a great little ecosystem. Is it Photoshop? It's not. You can do just about everything, but there are things inside of Photoshop. I've been using Photoshop since Photoshop 6, like the number 6. Like I've been on Photoshop since 7th grade. Um, and I learned it. I still to this day uh, contribute my entire career to learning Photoshop and Illustrator in 7th grade art class.
Yeah.
And when I say learn it, we got the Photoshop Bible and we had to do everything in that thing, from the, Mr. Potato Head with vegetables down to every other lasso tool trick in there. Um, that taught me everything I needed to know about a product, and I could then kind of expand on it from there. And the truth is, not much has changed in Photoshop in the last 20 years.
The UI hasn't
Um,
really changed all that
UI
much.
hasn't changed. There are some functions and tools in it that have evolved, gotten better. Some have gotten worse. But the reality of it is that product is pretty steadfast, and they haven't changed it for probably a lot of reasons regarding like legacy, and they don't want to piss their users off because have a full scale riot on their hands.
Right, but
Um,
I think one of the thing is their own product, the Lightroom, when it was first introduced, or when they just kind of broke it apart. Photoshop used to be where you kept all the photos and do post production or touch ups on your photos too. But then when the Lightroom became a thing, it just kind of like broke up, and then you can go either side back to back, but Lightroom became more of a photo post editing focus, whereas Photoshop became more of a production type of thing. So I think that's sort of the route
well,
that they took.
I think that was a smart thing to do, and now we're getting down to a whole different rabbit hole of software.
Sorry.
But no, I think Autodesk was smart to do that because they saw what Aperture was doing, which is an older Apple product that worked very similar to
Lightroom.
Adobe Lightroom,
Mm-hmm.
and it the problem with Photoshop for editing large volume of photos is you're opening every photo inside of Photoshop. It's not a very efficient workflow to edit many, many photographs. And with the advent of digital photography, you'd be dealing with, 500 photos instead of 50 photos.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you manage something like that? And I think that's a smart move on their part, breaking those two things apart and saying Photoshop will be for production and development of photo manipulation, and Lightroom or a product like Aperture is strictly for photo editing and organization. So how do we manipulate photos in just a simplified way?
Yeah.
So then you can go back and forth. I've got a zit on this photographed person I need to clean up. I can do that in Lightroom. If I need to retouch a photo from the 40s that has water damage, that goes to Photoshop, and I can have more control over what I'm doing.
That's what I
So
feel like what the vision should be. That's
yeah,
what I was alluding to.
yeah,
So basically
interesting.
V-Ray keep going down the route of having a heavy user base. And I stuck to Photoshop because I have a convenience in not trying to remember the shortcuts, and I don't need to remember
Hmm.
where the button was. Now I know as a muscle memory where they are and what it should be. So I don't need to relearn a software. Same thing for V-Ray. And then when I just need these sort of additional functionality, now digital photograph, you need a Lightroom, and now graphics card very strong, and you can do real time rendering very quick. Then you go V-Ray Vision, and maybe
Hmm.
somehow close the bridges every now and then whenever you come across an occasion where you really need to dial in some of these values that you just can't inside of Vision. I think that's what um, you know Chaos Group is heading to, but so far I feel like they're
Yeah,
just so, I don't know, close enough but different enough, and it throws a lot of people off.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they've released a few different products that are kind of interesting. So I just bought a license to V-Ray last month for another project we're currently working on, because it's a product design project and we needed V-Ray for Macs and some Node licenses. Um, so we're working on that right now. And I bought the V-Ray full license for a year, which wasn't too bad. The fact that I get all of the product stack, I think it was like with the 5 render nodes, I think it was like $1,300 with our current, like they were running a 20% off sale. You know, and I turned off auto update because we only need it for this project. But the project is a pretty valuable project, so we didn't mind spending a little bit of money on the rendering software. And I've been exploring kind of using Cosmos and some of the content that comes with it. V-Ray scans is something I've never really gotten to play with because it came out after I left.
Yeah, me
So
neither. Yeah.
yeah, it's been kind of interesting to see the evolution of the product being out of it from V-Ray 3 to V-Ray 5, skipping an entire generation.
Yep. Yep.
There's a lot of things that are the same, but there are a lot of tools that I have no idea what they do at this point, and I need to go back and
Yeah,
relearn the
like even
software.
Corona Render, that's another thing that was an acquisition that I never
Hmm.
really took part of, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I believe they had been trying to buy Corona for some time. I remember there was talk of buying Corona back when I was there, and Corona didn't want to sell.
No, they
So
bought
that,
it. They bought it
yeah, I
long
know,
time.
but
Yeah.
that what I'm saying is there was talk of buying Corona even back when I was there.
I see. I
Um,
see.
and I think Corona is developed out of Poland. I don't remember exactly. But they are um, a really talented team of developers. They've created a really great product, and I know a lot of artists who use it now because it's just easier. Because V-Ray has so much bloat and so much stuff, it's fine for product rendering, but I know a lot of ArcViz artists who have switched over to Corona because they're like, I don't need any of this stuff. I need proxies, I need good looking glass, and I need displacement, and I'm done.
Yeah.
That's all I really need.
Actually, now it just popped in my head. If for Photoshop, when you adjust the levels, you see
Hmm.
or brightness or and contrast for simple thing because it's a simple thing, right? The brightness and
Yeah.
contrast is something that everybody understands, and it's the first sort of dialogue
Hmm.
or window they go to, whether it be smart adjustment or just regular adjustment. But you can just crank up the brightness and it won't clip as much as it used to. And if you want to really clip it, and if you really want to dial in even further, and then there's a little checkbox that says legacy mode.
Yep.
So, brightness and the contrast or any level adjustments, those all have that checkbox for the legacy mode. So I feel like that's something that perhaps something as feature heavy as V-Ray should do. So perhaps there's just an advanced feature, and there is, and I'm not saying there isn't, but focus more on that where simplifying things and just have a little door to open more advanced feature, and they have done a few things like that, but I
Well,
think
that was the whole concept behind the flyouts on
fly it
either
on
side.
either side
You
and then
know, this is all you
advance.
need, but
Yeah,
if you need more, you can look at this side or this
right,
side.
right,
You know,
right.
so
Hmm.
you're so critical of the flyouts, and then you say, I wish I could just have it so that it would roll out.
It just rolls out too much. I'm telling you. Yeah, like I just want a little more control, not the whole stack. It's just too much.
Well, so here's the thing about that. Did you ever see there's in V-Ray, there was a little button on that rollout on the side where it would expand to a standard and then the pro version.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, you
There's
do
a
know about
little
that. Yep.
slide to
The little
open.
sliders icon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, we wanted to make it even more simplified than what was visible, but every time we did, we got so much pushback from the community. So that right flyout panel ended up kind of devolving into just a lot of
True.
stuff.
I've seen that movement. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was part of the community where there was a lot of pushback. Not that I was pushing back any, but I've seen a lot of
Mhm.
pushbacks
Mhm.
too.
Likely. Mhm.
And one of the few things was
I saw you in the forums pushing back all the time.
no, I'm not the pushbacker.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's V-Ray. The days of the V-Ray is really just walking down the memory lane for me. And it used to be the daily driver for me. So, I had spent hours waiting for that bucket to go around. And
It is, I'll tell you what though, it is still to this day so satisfying watching because we've got 7 machines now at the office that have anywhere from 32 to 128 threads. So it's so nice to just watch them just
progress
one, two,
render is
three.
another thing, though. That
I
that
hate progress render.
it's not as
Hate it.
satisfying. It's
It's
not
not.
one it is not as satisfying. And for the longest time the result between bucket render and progress render was different. That was another issue that I had when I was using it. It
You
shouldn't be different, but the render time and because you
I
can.
don't think you had your settings right.
No, I didn't.
It was user
It's a
error.
user error. It definitely was. I'm not saying it's because it's supposed to do exactly the
Yeah,
same
it's a
thing,
clarity thing. It is. It does
and
do the
you
same thing.
apply the denoiser
Um,
at the end, and supposedly it should look the
did
same.
you? The one thing that I used to have an issue with it with the progressive render is I would get bucket squares on my progressive render. Did you ever notice that? Because I would render on the network and I would have multiple machines.
No, no,
And
no.
what would
I
end up
didn't have that
happening,
issue.
I had this issue on a couple of instances. If all the machines were not connecting to the assets, you would still get funky things happening where you could see a square happening where one of the machines was rendering that section and it didn't have all the information, so the section would look funny.
And I started using Progress Render when it was first launching with it, and when Denoiser was first being introduced. And by default, the denoiser wasn't on, and there was like a certain arbitrary number to stop the progressive render
Hmm.
so that it's finalized. And I didn't understand like where I had to finish the render or what value I need to put
Yeah,
in
it
so that
wasn't very clear.
it matches exactly what I had been rendering with bucket render. So I'm reluctant to now go into progressive render because I'm not sure how to do this. And there wasn't, as you
It's gotten
said,
a lot better, and I think, this is all coming back to communication with your user group
exactly, like
and
there wasn't
having
a
clear.
official sort
There's
of,
too many options. There's just
yeah,
too many options. Like Enscape, there you have capture the thing. There's no other options to edit how it renders. It just does it. That's how V-Ray started, but then they added V-Ray RT, real time. Real time was only real time if you had a processor that could do it faster. You've got their vision thing now, and that's great, but it's not quite what it needs to be. You've got V-Ray GPU, which is different from V-Ray CPU, because
which is
of the
different
different
from real
architecture,
time.
which is different from real time, which is different from vision, which is different from this, that, and the other thing. So there are just too many things that, are confusing for users. But, everybody wants the newest, fastest thing, and, they're trying. So
Well, yeah, the history and the
maybe we need to
memory.
sit down and talk render farms, because that's always a fun one.
Nah, I never bother with it. I had issues with the networks when I was using it.
Oh man,
Yeah.
Swarm is the best thing in the world.
Well, Swarm was what was introduced with V-Ray 3.0, wasn't it?
Yep. Yeah, Swarm is probably the coolest part of V-Ray 3, because it would just I would
It just worked though.
it
That was,
worked. It
yeah,
worked
it worked
really
very
well.
well
I,
compared to other things that constantly break.
I think yeah, it was the one thing that was like the saving grace, because it worked so freaking well. The one thing that I really um, get a little bit frustrated with, though, is users would constantly email us all bent out of shape because uh, their swarm render wouldn't work, it wouldn't connect, this, that, and the other thing. And 9 times out of 10, it was because they were trying to render over Wi-Fi.
Oh, I
And we
see.
would get, I remember we would get like, I think it was actually uh, Archilime Studios and Jack Dickerson and I talked about it, and we were trying to figure out why Swarm wasn't working. And I was finally like, "You're not rendering over Wi-Fi." It's like, "Yeah, why wouldn't I?" I'm like, "Oh, that's why. You don't have enough bandwidth to do that." Like, I think now you can do it with Wi-Fi
You
6.
can do cloud rendering, the fancy
Well, that's
cloud.
different. Cloud rendering is different. That's just uploading your file to a farm where it renders.
Right.
But
But you don't have to worry
you
about.
know,
You can do it on Wi-Fi for cloud.
V-Ray Cloud is pretty slick too,
It
though.
is. It is.
I'll be honest with you. That saved our butts a few times with, getting stuff out the door, because it just works. Because the best thing about one of the great things about V-Ray is the V-Ray scene file. .vr scene is such an inclusive file type and just encapsulates everything that you need, and it does it in such a watertight way. When you upload it to V-Ray Cloud, it looks exactly
I mean,
like
it's a
what it would look like on your
standalone
computer.
export basically,
It
and
is, but
yeah,
so few programs do that properly.
yeah,
I mean, look at Enscape. I can't even send them a broken
standalone.
scene because, well, no, I can't send them a standalone either, because that it doesn't give them enough information. They need the model. So I can't resource collect the entire model and send it to them.
Yeah, you can. Standalone has all the
No,
resources.
it breaks all the links.
No.
Yes. Okay, if I have a network drive with all of my assets on a network drive,
I
and
thought
all of those assets are linked to that file in another location on the network drive. If I send that SketchUp file to the Enscape team, those are all hard paths. They don't get any of those assets. They
no,
don't get any of the proxies.
I'm not talking about SketchUp, but when you export a standalone, the exe
No, that,
files.
yes, all of those assets get packaged into it, but not, they can't test the SketchUp file for what
No,
broke.
no, they can't. They can't. Yeah, that's
That's
right.
the problem.
Well, that's
Yeah.
not a standalone. That what I mean is that exe file
Yeah, I know what
executable.
you're talking about. That, yes, you can send them a standalone, and that's great. But what I'm talking about is Vray has a collection tool that you can collect the entire SketchUp scene,
Right, and package it so
including the
that
SketchUp file,
yeah,
and pack it up. Um, Very few softwares do that
Revit
properly.
does that for that matter, and they actually have a transmittal packaging tool.
I don't like it. It's a pain in the butt.
Anyways, where was I going with this? But yeah, I think V-Ray really had its days, and it's good to hear everything from your end for having being on the front seat, hearing all the users and the voices of top down. I'm sure you caught a lot of heat in there, and I,
It's really funny because all the same users are now in the Enscape forums yelling at the Enscape guys.
well, you see, I'm not. That's the thing. Like I just yell on my stream instead
You
of
just have a
or
different username so that you can sneak on there under the radar
no,
and give
guys.
them a hard time.
For the record, I've always been Joseph Kim 626 with the blue face.
Except when he's Steve Miller architecture and he's yelling at them. I really hope there's not a Steve Miller architecture out there now. I just made that up. Steve Miller, I'm just teasing. You're fine. I bet
Yeah.
you're a great guy to work with.
Well, what do you think of next week topic, perhaps?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure.
We need to have somebody on. So, what
Yeah,
about somebody like Tony or
yeah, we can get Tony on. Austin was asking about when we would have time to get him on. If you want some technical talk, um, we can do technical talk Tuesday. Let's
sure?
see. Uh, Corey Rubidoux always an option.
Yes,
Hear what he's
absolutely.
working on over at Arc Vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, we got some options.
All right. Well, we'll reach out to some of those guys and see if they're available. If any of you watching on live or on the record, if there's any sort of guest or topic that you would like to suggest and have us discuss or have a opinion or perhaps questions about it, then I welcome you guys to leave it down on the comment as well. And I think that's where we're gonna wrap up since we well past 1 hour mark here. Do you have anything else to add?
Don't forget about Envision 21 coming up at the end of this month.
Yes, absolutely. I just
How's your video going?
I shot my video, but I as I'm editing, I'm noticing a couple of things. So we'll see. We'll see
I'm
how it
shooting
goes.
mine tomorrow. We'll
Okay.
see. Oof. Yes, I'm doing efficient workflows for large models with Enscape.
Cool.
So yeah.
Yeah, I will be talking about conceptual rendering
Ooh,
and how to apply that in architectural design workflow. So, little
nice.
tips and tricks about how to use sort of work in progress model rather than photorealistic type of model.
I like it. I like it.
Hmm.
Well, good luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing yours,
Me too.
and looking forward to recording mine.
Yeah. Uh, Tony
All
said,
right.
who's a guest speaker on Enscape event? We're not. We are the speakers, not the guest speaker. I don't know if that
I
answered.
guess we're guest speakers. We're guests of Enscape, and we're speaking.
Okay, yeah. both of us are guest
Yeah.
speakers. Yes.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, so that
Well,
should be fun.
yeah, that should be fun. I think we're gonna wrap up here today. Thanks everybody for watching tonight. If stars line up, we'll see you again next week on Tuesday.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Good night.
Take care.